This is Madam Speaker, and I'm asking, is voting the only way to have a say in our country? And if you choose to not vote, must you shut up? We bring in our jury, and let's start with Eva. I know that you want to get into some of the thoughts that the panel has raised, but maybe you can also touch on what it means to conscientiously not vote.
I think it's very, very important, and I think that providing a space for voters actually to tick the none of the above applies box is very, very important. And it's not so that you know the invisible candidate or the non-existing candidate is going to win an election. It's just providing for people actually to get in the game. And
but what's the consequence of that? Just simply saying none of the above. What is the material impact on democracy, on getting a country to look and feel like something you can be a part of?
We need to get citizens and the electorate a chance to actually say we are unhappy. We don't see that there are any other, any other outlets. And I think it's not so that it's a cop-out or a cheap option. It's actually for when we talk about this, get involved. That is one way of getting involved. And that is saying that actually, you know what, none of the above applies, but I'm here. Oh. I want to participate.
Yeah, maybe some people think a bagel at a local coffee shop or some time at the Shisanyama is going to be better spent than ticking none of the above. Kaya?
It's a difficult one, but I think for me the key issue here is that, when we talk about all the rights that we have, what we tend to forget is that they come with particular obligations and particular responsibilities. And for me, the key thing here is that the only way to enjoy all these rights fully is to then sort of sign up for the associated obligations. And if one of the obligations has to be that everybody has to be forced to vote in an election, so that you create that enabling environment, you legitimize this environment that then says these are rights that you can be able to enjoy, then for me that's a more transparent system. We cannot, 25 years into democracy, have a country where there's so many voters who are simply saying we're not interested in this process. It's
but something is happening that is making them disinterested, and that's perhaps not what we're talking about. Because it doesn't matter whether you have...
The important thing is that I need to be able to see them showing up on the ballot and say this is the thing that is making us disaffected. We can't then be forced to then speculate in a vacuum to say they didn't show up. So
but you will still be stuck with an electoral system.
They should be able to say that. You can even put in the ballot to say, okay, if you do not vote with these political parties, perhaps option number 49 should have been, let's have a referendum on particular issues.
Okay.
That becomes a very...
I want to talk about the practicalities of a referendum from a collective canvassing point of view and also from an immediacy point of view. Now, Koketso, you saw 48 parties on the ballot. None of them seemed to talk to you. You didn't vote. I think we're allowed to say that.
Yes.
Yeah. Why? Tell us why.
Scandalous.
Oh, not at all. It's not the first time I do this, and I have spoiled my ballot a couple of times as well. It's a very deliberate choice. I think... number one, when we talk about decreasing voters, we must not think of South Africa as unique. We have seen across the world, that there is a pushback against, what one could consider establishment politics. But at the same time as well, we must understand that in a country like ours, voting is just but one of many ways to participate.
But it's the one we emphasize the most. It is the holy grail of democratic expression in our country from Cape to Cairo.
No, completely. It's seen that way, but I would argue differently. Both there are other formal and informal participatory mechanisms which South Africa is very robust about. Now, for someone like me, I think there have been multiple times, right? You go into the voting room, you think about some of the things that you have experienced, that you are watching around you, and you think that there is no party that is here that represents my aspirations, that is offering any ideas, that is offering concrete ways in which we can move out of some very big troubles.
Okay, so stale and stuck. How you want to jump in really quickly, Eva, and then we'll come back to the panel.
I think for me the key issue here is that in as much as there's multiple ways in which you can participate in this, what makes this particular general election unique to me is that it's the one where all the voices have got equal prominence. So of course if I say to people that you can participate in an NGO, there's still a source of some type of capital associated with that. Can you access that NGO? Can you access that political structure? Can you access the courts, for some example? So for me, on a general election, it is the one day where my grandmother from Matatiele has got as much prominence in really influencing.
What does it mean when it's all counted up, I think, is the real question, Eva.
I mean, we're all equal in front of that ballot box, and I think that's very important to emphasize. But I would also like to come back to these 9 million people who have, consciously or not, whether they've done it consciously or not. It's a critical mass, and
they bother to register.
To hear those voices, and how do we capture those voices? I think that is the bigger question, and how we do that is then debatable.
All right. So, Koketso, have you forfeited your right to be vocal now because you didn't vote? Must you shut up?
Absolutely not. It is still my government. I am still a person who is owed certain obligations, who has certain things that should be fulfilled and protected like anybody else.
How do you respond to that, Masutu?
I think Koketso paints a very interesting picture. I would imagine that even if there are some fundamental things you may not agree with, there must be a way you give an indication so that someone takes some steps to meet your obligations. In an election like the one we've had, we know we have spoiled ballots. And we often look at them and say, you know, it means education was not effective. But she's saying education, it's not necessarily
The issue.
the issue. There are certain other issues. And
So how do you treat them, from an IEC perspective, how do you treat these spoiled ballots? You think...
No, we do look at them and say, well, perhaps next time when we do education, this is what we need to emphasize more and so on and so forth. Because sometimes people mark completely outside and spoil it in that way. And you wonder whether it was education. But what she's saying, it's not necessarily education.
Yeah, there's a highly sophisticated voter that's saying, bugger all of you, I don't want any of you. Yeah. TK, here's the thing. We don't get to choose the leaders directly. We can vote for a party and then they run with the process. We're only a participant up until a certain point.
And that's where my problem with, I think, the South African population or the citizenry is that why aren't we involved in that process? Now, I always have problems with people. If you know this is how the game is governed, why don't you participate, or rather say, listen, I'm going to change it completely? And this is what I've always asked citizens. Okay, you might not, let's say X party, because I don't want to promote any particular party. Why aren't you involved in that process? And I think there is a question that needs to be asked of a citizen, which is to say, if I don't like what's happening there, why am I not involved? And I always ask this to any panel I go to. Okay, let's say you don't like the national picture. Do you know who your councillor is? At the most basic level.
Yeah, but we've mined that one, especially in the aftermath of service delivery protests. Yeah. They have limited powers. There's a whole supply chain of people that must run with the baton that local ward councillors are raising, and they never get activated.
But there are structures, and a lot of times people are not involved in those structures.
All right, but let's go then to the alternatives really quickly if we can. I want to talk about referendums as an immediate and collective way to understand where the country is at and what people want. Does it have scope in South Africa? Should we be thinking about it, especially in a highly sort of connected age?
I do, and there's always one example I like to use. The issue of, that came out, I think, 2 years ago, Judge Davis's report on executive pay, or let's say members of parliament pay. I would have actually liked a referendum to say, listen, why must you get 91,000? It should have been 91,000, another amount, or keep your salary or take it lower. So at that level, I think a lot of us would have said, you know what? Whether it gets would even say, you know what, there I'm going to go vote. Because I don't believe these people deserve this money. Because I think maybe if it's an issue of saying getting people involved in political, let's say, electoral processes, a referendum is the best way to go about it.
Thoughts on the referendum?
Referendums are tricky because, we go to the ballot box every 4 years, every 5 years, depending on whereabouts in the world we live. But having a referendum and this idea of an armchair democracy where we can constantly vote or constantly put our voices into doesn't provide for much deliberation. So I think that, as a society, we're, and I'm not only talking about
armchair democracy.
Yes.
Kaya?
Look, I think for me, of course, referendums are an option, but for me, a referendum, of course, tends to be specific on one particular issue. And in South Africa, when you can't even get at least 48 political parties to agree on really what should the agenda be, imagine trying to expect 40 million citizens to then say this should be the issue that should be put to a referendum. It's still a bit tricky. So I'm still going back to the original idea. You must have universal compulsory voting. We must have universal and compulsory registration, and then we start from there.
So in Kaya's world, you'd be forced to the polls, Koketso. You like that?
No, completely. Although I must say, with his first point, I completely agree with him. Hey, with a country like ours, I think it would be quite dangerous. But on the issue of being forced to vote, I think what I'd be much more interested in, and I must confess, I've worked for the IEC once upon a time. I'd actually be very interested in spoiled votes, right? Because I used to do that, sometimes write a message of exactly why. And at the time, when I was in an election official capacity or whatever capacity, I loved the thing of looking at what are the reasons people are giving. Because actually it does happen.
Okay, what were some of those, really quickly?
Whether it's the stuff about aspirations or whether it's very hyper-local things, right? If you're in a community like local government elections, I remember 2011, people could mention very specific things that have happened that mean I cannot vote for this party, that party.
All right.
Yeah, and I thought that was interesting. So that would give a lot of insight as well.
Okay, take a breath on that point, unless you just want to sneak something in really
I'm just
quickly.
saying that there's a lot of thought that goes into coming, as you say, pitching up and spoiling
actually
your ballot
saying
as well. So,
something.
you know, there's a
Yes.
process to that as well.
We get closing comments from my guest just now. This is Madam Speaker.